For today's lesson, we're starting topic 2 of medicine, and that is looking at Renaissance medicine. So, Renaissance is a time period between 1500 to 1700, so it's right after the Middle Ages. Just to kind of give you a little bit of background about the Renaissance period and the Middle Ages. Um, the Renaissance, like I said, was this period of time from the 14th century to the 17th century, and the actual word Renaissance means rebirth. Just to give you some context here, after the fall of the Roman Empire, that's when the Middle Ages began. And the Middle Ages is a part of a time, an era in which it's known as the Dark Ages. And during these Dark Ages, as you can imagine, the idea is there is a loss of knowledge. The advances in science, art, and government that had been made by the Greeks and the Romans during the ancient period were lost during that time. Just to give you some background about the Middle Ages, and hopefully that can make you understand just a little bit more about life in the medieval period. So, what we are looking at from today's lesson is this, well, the name in itself, the Renaissance period, is looking at this movement of kind of looking back to the ancient world. So, it's the rebirth of classical, so in the Roman times, classical ideas about philosophy, knowledge, arts, culture, um, and the idea of coming out of that darkness of the Dark Ages. So just before we go on a little bit, I just want to have a look at the PowerPoint to kind of think about what we're talking about here. So the question for today's lesson is, why was the Renaissance important in the development of medicine? And what we're trying to do is we're trying to explain the impact of the Renaissance, explain the impact the Renaissance had on the development of medicine. So some pretty important keywords here. So we've got Renaissance, and we will go into that a little bit later. Printing press, Paracelsus, Martin Luther, and humanism. So, just a little bit about humanism. So, a big part of the Renaissance was this cultural movement called humanism. And the real concept of humanism is it was a philosophy that all people should be educated in the classical arts, literature, science, and technology. It's the idea that people should kind of break free from teachings of religious orthodoxy, so those traditional views that we really see um, having dominance in the Middle Ages, and to really kind of encourage inquiry. Now, inquiry is just a kind of fancy word for thinking. So, under in the ancient world, under the Greeks and the Romans, there was a big emphasis on philosophy. It's kind of the growth of philosophy. It's what you really think of when you think of Greek and Roman Empire, the idea of all these very important philosophers. Um, and that's what the Renaissance kind of encouraged. It was this rebirth of this time where people were critical of ideas and beliefs, and they were able to have confidence in changing those views and challenging them. It also, in terms of art, looked for realism and human emotion. So, one of the most important paintings that have come out of the Renaissance is the Mona Lisa. And the reason why the Mona Lisa is so significant is because it represents this idea of humanism in art, this idea of making sure there's emotion and again realism. So if you even have a look, so I think we'll look at these two images first. So one image is from the Middle Ages and one image is from the Renaissance period. Now, I've just told you that the idea of the Renaissance period is looking to, go back into the classical arts. and this rebirth of thinking. Just some context about the ancient world. So the ancient world under the Roman and the Greeks obviously had their own kind of myths and gods. And over here we have the birth of Venus, the painting, Botticelli's Birth of Venus. Venus is the god of kind of love and fertility in the Roman Empire, and it would be Aphrodite for the Greeks. So obviously we can identify this painting here being the Renaissance painting, and you should be able to see. So this means that this one is from the medieval period. The idea of humanism coming to play in both ways. The idea that it's, going back to the ancient world, the classical thinking, and also the idea of within art being more realistic. So if you were to see here, it's Madonna with child. The image itself, you can see the proportions are very odd. You've got a child that looks disproportionate. You've got very long, slender fingers. You wouldn't argue that this is realistic because of the lack of proportions. The image itself is very religious. It has religious imagery. If you think about it, it's child. It potentially could look like Mary and Jesus. So even from the art form, from the Middle Ages and Renaissance, you should be able to see the kind of ideas that distinguish both time periods. So for the Middle Ages, it was religion. We know the church dominated life in the Middle Ages. And for the Renaissance period, you have this kind of creativeness, humanism, and the love of the arts, the love of thinking, the love of culture. So that's just kind of to give you a bit of background of what we're studying, and maybe to give you some idea of what potential changes there might be already, because I've kind of just spoken about the idea of inquiry and being comfortable to break through and question and challenge things and move away from that traditional way of thinking. So that should give you an idea of what factors might come into play during the Renaissance period. So our question today is, I'll say it again, why was the Renaissance important in the development of medicine? And we're trying to explain the impact the Renaissance had. So the impact, things that happened in the Renaissance and the impact it made on the development of medicine. So what things happened in the Renaissance period that would have impacted the progress of medicine? So lesson 9, which starts from page 23, you have, as usual, your low stake quiz questions. So if you can please answer the questions. Again, they will be about what you've studied, so it will be about the Middle Ages. You then have a list of activities, so thinking about what I've just said to you, to explain what the Renaissance mean in your own words, and you have some phrases below that can help you reword a definition about the Renaissance. So we know the time period, so our keywords here are 1500s, challenge the church and existing ideas, Greek and Roman thinking, ask questions and a love of inquiry, new ideas and discoveries, rebirth, and a renewed interest. So really, you just need to think about creating a definition that revolves around the idea of a renewed interest into the ancient world and what they stand for. And then those are the things that they stand for. So if you can please create a definition and put that in there. Now this next section, it's a lot of information that you really need to make sure you know, because this summarizes key things that happened in the Renaissance and the impact of those things. So on the left, so the first column on the left is just a kind of recap in the Middle Ages. So you have here this first one about books. So you just have to complete the sentence. So over here it says books were written by hand by monks and nuns. And then you need to think, what does that mean? Again, our questions here was always asking about the development of medicine. What does that mean for medicine and for progress? Think about, how many books are being reached by people, who's able to read them. Think about the language. Think about the people that are actually writing them. Does that mean anything? The purpose in which they're written. You then have here the Pope. So the idea of the church being conservative, and the impact that would have. You then would write down here what would be the impact of that. Our next one is the idea of education. So again, this one's completely done for you. So the recap of: university doctors were not taught to think for themselves. They studied Hippocrates and Galen. Experiments that were conducted were done to prove Galen was right about the body, and so to not make new discoveries. The art, so what we just spoke about the image. Why the church, so the church agreeing with Galen's theory of design, and as a result, so you should be thinking about, if someone was to challenge Galen, who might actually come to Galen's defense, and why would that be the case? And then the idea that the Middle Ages wasn't invested in science and learning at all. That wasn't their attitude in their society. And because of that, the lack of, drive for learning and inquiry really made sure there was little progress. So once you've completed the recap for the Middle Ages, you then are told in this middle column things that have now been put in place in the Renaissance. So that might be inventions or events that have taken place in the Renaissance period. And then your box over here, which is completely empty, would be an area in which you are explaining the impact that this invention or event would have on medicine. So it would work as you saying the recap, reading through the evidence of whatever's happened in the Renaissance, and then explaining the impact on that on medicine. So you need to remember that your title is asking you about the development of medicine, so the impact it had on medicine. So you need to really make sure that you're linking that back to the question. So we'll do the first one together. So we just said over here that books were written by hand by monks and nuns. This meant, so we can say this meant that there was not a high quantity of books because they were all handwritten. This also meant that people were reliant on the church for their knowledge, as it was the monks and the nuns who wrote books. So something like that. Then let's think about what happened in the Renaissance period. So an important technological development was the invention of the printing press. So incredibly significant time for our course. If we had to think about a factor in medicine that this would match up to, straight away we can see that communication as a factor of medicine is relevant here. So let's find out what a printing press actually is. So Johann Gutenberg introduced printing to Europe in the 1450s, which meant printers were able to print thousands of books quickly and cheaply. So straight away we see an impact here, and that is the impact it had on communication. And remember, we need to link back to medicine. So perhaps medical books and medical ideas and knowledge. So what you would put in this box here is you can decide what kind of sentence starter you want to use. You could write something like the impact of this on medicine, on the development of was that medical knowledge ideas could now be taught and spread on a wider level as there was increased communication through the printing press. You also need to really make sure in these boxes that you're thinking about how might this, because obviously we don't know yet because we're studying it, so you need to think how might this improve medicine, and that's what you need to be thinking about, especially if you're struggling to explain the impact. Literally just think, how might this thing that's being explained in this middle column improve medicine? Now when we think about improving medicine, we may be thinking about a number of things. So we might be thinking about improving medical knowledge, which is what this one is focused on. We might be thinking about being able to challenge the existing institutions to be able to increase the role of individuals and to perhaps influence ideas of inventions. We might be thinking about the idea of improving the skills that people in medicine need to have. So if we think back to that picture and the idea of humanism, if we were to really consider what humanism truly meant for medicine. Now, we spoke about in this image over here the idea of disproportionate images. And if you were to be studying the body or the anatomy, the structure and the way that the body kind of runs in the Middle Ages, you'd be relying on images that aren't particularly accurate. So the idea of humanism is it's promoting a more accurate depiction of the body. And the way to kind of explain the impact of that on medicine would be, well, once you are able to depict the body in a certain way and there's more realistic images, this might improve surgery or it can improve knowledge about the body. So when you are answering each one, really think about how might it improve medicine. So you have to just really do that for 5 of them, and there is a model for you in your booklets anyway, the last one being the microscope. So this one would be talking about the idea of improvements in technology. And once you've done that, you are essentially finished. But just to kind of finish our lesson off, I want us to think about, in the Renaissance period, what factors do we think have already shown as maybe a factor of development in the Renaissance? And we should be able to pick out, just from doing that activity and the images, that we see, like I said before, an improvement in communication. Microscope means we see improvements in technology. We see improvements in education through educating on anatomy and the printing press, allowing more books and different sort of platforms of education. And then we clearly see an attitude towards seeking improvements, and that will be, we didn't really speak about that one there. So I'll just briefly talk you through a very important time in history, which was this one over here. So I'm just going to delete that quickly. So this one over here, so I'm just going to read that middle box there. In 1517, the German monk Martin Luther published the 95 Thesis, a letter criticizing the corrupt practices of the Catholic Church. He believed that the Church was not teaching the Bible faithfully. His protest led to the formation of the Protestant Church. So Martin Luther would definitely be categorized as someone who is part of seeking improvements, and more importantly, he's someone who's actually willing to challenge the church. And this becomes very successful in that he's actually the reason. So we call this the Reformation, in which the Protestant Church is now formed. So before this time period, like we've spoken about before, in the Middle Ages, England at the time was Catholic, and there was only the Catholic Church. The creation of the Protestant Church was because of this man, Martin Luther, and he's an individual who's able to challenge the church. So you need to think about, for this box, really be thinking about how might that have improved medicine? What might that mean for the church? What might that mean for other people who perhaps secretly thought that the church was corrupt, the Catholic Church was corrupt? And hopefully, again, you are remembering our medicine factors, and you can see how already we see some improvement in the Renaissance period. Now, once you finish that, you just have to fill in your summary. And in your summary, I would like you to simply just explain how. So I'm just going to write it here, the instructions. How each factor has played a part in the Renaissance period. So I want you in the summary box to just think about how can you show that communication has improved. So think of an example from your information here, like the printing press. How has attitudes seeking improvement been evident? How has education improved? And how has science and technology progressed? So if you can please make 4 bullet points based on each one, just explaining how each factor has played a part. So what I mean by that is literally write down something like communication has improved in the Renaissance because, and then pick out an example. And you need to do that for each one. And then you are done with lesson 9. Thank you.